Welcome to Afternoon Briefing this Thursday. Greg Jennett with you from the nation's capital here on Ngunnawal country. And Fran Kelly once again is back with us in Sydney on Gadigal land. Welcome again, Fran. Last night's leaders' debate has, we can say, been run, and we're told by a poll of audience members present, run and won by Anthony Albanese. Narrowly, so that'll be contested, of course. But the Labor leader and Scott Morrison, Fran, have long since moved on.
They certainly have. Day 11, Greg, had Anthony Albanese on the New South Wales South Coast in the seat of Gilmore, and Scott Morrison starting out in outer metropolitan Brisbane in the seat of Longman. The Prime Minister did, however, have to clear up a clumsy expression, let's put it that way, from last night's debate, the one in which he said he and his wife Jenny had been, quote, blessed not to have experienced disability with their two daughters.
Nice to be here. It's nice to be up north. North of New South Wales anyway.
It's the first time the Prime Minister has actually travelled to Queensland this election campaign.
Oh, yeah, he's doing great. Okay.
Stay tuned.
Well, good morning, Living Gems. To the Living Gems of Living Gems. And they went round and they told people, don't vote for the Liberals because they're going to sell Medicare. It was a complete lie. When you're Prime Minister, you're running the government. Public servants don't run the government. Prime Ministers and their ministers run governments. And I've often referred to my own children as blessing. As you know, we were 14 years in the waiting. I was seeking to respect the challenges they face, not the opposite. And I would hope that people would accept that at face value, and I deeply apologise for any offence that it caused.
I think every child is a blessing for parents.
Opposition leader Anthony Albanese has turned his attention to the New South Wales South Coast, touching down in the seat of Gilmore.
Hey, how you going? Good, thank you. I'm Karen. Hi, Karen. Nice to meet you.
Hi, I'm Jess.
Hi, Jess.
Hi, I'm David. Good to meet you.
All of our priorities will be a priority.
And he spoke a lot last night, Mr Albanese. Over the last 3 years, he has sought to make a virtue, not of being a big ideas man, but being a no ideas man.
I could see, watching that debate, that he scored a points win. Some people might call it a draw.
Hello. If you can answer my question, I'll vote for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Could you please tell me what the unemployment rate is in Australia?
4%.
I'm going to vote for you.
Thank you. Scott Morrison always goes missing, and he always blames someone else. Lovely, gentle.
Yeah, she knows I'm part of the place, so...
I'm missing my pooch. I'm running in this campaign to be Australia's Prime Minister, to implement the policies that I'm taking to this election.
But I hope everything goes well for you.
Oh, thank you. Very kind of you. So everyone was on the side of every competitor. Yes.
There's real egg on his face. So much egg on his face, it's looking like an omelette.
You can imagine what the Twitter sphere would say about that.
I'm very jealous of your supply chain. Yes. Very jealous. Excellent.
All right, so on and on it goes. We're now into...
That's elections, you got to love them, Greg, these campaigns.
Well, they're pictorially rich, that much we can say,
we
Fran.
can agree on.
Even if at times they feel a little shallow. That's not exactly true, though, when you consider that we're essentially now into day two of what's becoming a sustained and, I suppose at least rhetorically anyway, Fran, a full-blown debate over foreign policy and national security. This, of course, after the Solomon Islands government signed the security pact with Beijing. So why don't we try and attempt to trace how it escalated further here, Fran, revisiting some comments by the key players. We'll go to Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison. But it's pretty clear both sides feel there's some accounting to be done by the other for positions that they've taken on China and the Pacific Islands nations. But I suppose the question, Fran, is what risks come with having that debate right now?
Well, first thing, what you say is right. It's good to be having a policy debate, isn't it? The risk of having a debate at the moment like this about China and its relationship with countries in our region is our political leaders playing into China's hands. If China is trying to do anything else, I'm sure it's got other plans in the Pacific, but if it's also hoping to cause division in Australia right now, here we are right in the middle of an election campaign with this issue front and centre. The government of Australia basically accusing the would-be government of siding with China. Well, then, China's doing it. I mean, last night, Greg, in the debate, the Prime Minister, he said those words. He said, why is Labor siding with China? Effectively calling Labor a bunch of traitors, isn't he?
Yeah, so we're going to try and deconstruct the afterplay that flowed from that, Fran. Let's do that now because, as we'll hear in a moment, Scott Morrison's got his own compilation, his list of issues on which he thinks Labor quibbled too much over the last 3 years. We'll break that down for you. But it's equally true that Anthony Albanese has his own list of built-up criticisms of the Morrison government. When it comes specifically to the Pacific and foreign aid, why don't we hear from the opposition leader running through where he thinks the Morrison government has dropped the ball.
Why is it that in the Pacific, where Australia has been the security partner of choice since the Second World War, Australia went missing by making cuts to the aid budget, by not standing up with the people of the Pacific when it came to action on climate change? And why is it that the government was so complacent and kept saying it was all under control before this occurred?
Well, that's Labor's big point, Greg, isn't it? That the Morrison government's been complacent. It fits into Labor's narrative that Scott Morrison is missing in action when it counts. We heard that in the montage today. We've heard it every day this campaign. We'll hear it in Labor's big new ad, which kicks off tonight. There is perhaps some criticism to be had over Australia's position on climate change because we know Pacific leaders really scream about that from the rooftops at every opportunity. Climate change, they've told Australia and the world, is their #1 issue. It's an existential threat for some of those nations. But there's little recognition too from Labor when it talks of Australia's, past strong relationship with the Solomon Islands or our Pacific family. They're not really recognising the change in China's power and influence in the world and in our region. And today, Greg, Scott Morrison continued the fight, pressing the point he made last night in the debate. In his words, Labor is siding with China.
So when I look at that record, on each occasion, have they backed the Australian government in standing up for Australia? Or have they run the talking points, have they run the lines of those who are seeking to criticise Australia for the important decisions that we've taken in our national interest? That's why I made the claim I did last night, because it's backed up by a Labor Party who has played politics with national security, despite their claims to the contrary.
And the record he was talking about there, Greg, was, a list that he went through last night and again today, including Labor's reaction, this is what the Prime Minister said, to China's rolling trade blocks against Australia. He included criticism of Australia leading the calls for a pandemic inquiry. He accused Labor of even siding with France over the cancellation of the subs contract. And now, of course, the Labor criticism of Australia's efforts to head off the security pact between China and the Solomon Islands. That's the record Scott Morrison is talking about. Well, Richard Marles is Deputy Labor Leader, and I spoke to him earlier from the New South Wales Central Coast. Richard Marles, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Good to be here, Fran.
The Prime Minister's accused Labor of siding with China on a number of occasions. He's basically saying you're all traitors, isn't he?
I think what we're seeing with the Prime Minister and the fact that the moment that he receives any criticism about the way in which he governs, and particularly when it comes to foreign policy, he seeks to essentially accuse us all of being unpatriotic and not siding with the country is pathetic and it is puerile. I mean, it is our job to criticise government, and frankly, they deserve criticism for the failure in which they have managed the relationship with Solomon Islands. Now, that's not taking China's side. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We accept there has been strategic contest in the Pacific with China for a considerable period of time. That's a contest in which it's absolutely imperative that Australia prevails. And that's why it's really important that Australia is putting its best foot forward and doing its best within the Pacific. We really should be the natural country and partner of choice for countries in the Pacific to work with. In my experience, that's what we are. And yet the fact that we find ourselves in this situation says everything about the way in which Scott Morrison and his government have dropped the ball. Now, that's not taking the side of China. That is making a criticism of the way in which Scott Morrison has managed and promoted Australia's interests.
The Prime Minister and the Defence Minister pointed out today that Labor hasn't had the benefit of the intelligence briefings. You haven't had the advice from the agency. In other words, as Peter Dutton said, you're shooting from the hip. I mean, are you just playing politics with this if you don't know what the advice the government's been getting in terms of, steering its response?
Well, the questions I would ask, and ask it having some experience in the Pacific, is which minister has been present in terms of going to Solomon Islands on frequent occasions over the last 12 months? Which minister has built the relationship with the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands and his government? Which minister went there as soon as advice was given that China and Solomon Islands might be pursuing an agreement of this kind? And the government don't have answers to those questions. And asking those questions doesn't place us on the side of China, it places us on the side of Australia's national interest and seeking to defend it. And if this government had a clear game plan in terms of the way in which it was managing Australia's interests, it would have an answer to each one of these questions, but it doesn't. The fact that America was had made a decision to send a senior official of its government, Kurt Campbell, to Solomon Islands to deal with this question before we even heard that this government was going to send Zed Sezelja, says everything about the failure of this government in terms of managing the relationship with Solomon Islands and the degree to which they have dropped the ball here.
Yes, but you heard the Prime Minister say very clearly today that the advice from the agencies was not to send the Foreign Minister, but to send Senator Sezelja. That was advice from the agencies. That's what the Prime Minister made clear.
But Fran, it's not as though...
Would you have ignored the advice of the agencies if you were the government?
Well, what was the advice of the agencies in terms of building a relationship over the last 2 years, since this, and indeed longer than that, since this government has come to power? What was the advice of the agencies about the need to be present in an ongoing way? And you can bet that the advice of the agencies was not to keep at arm's length, was not to keep a distance, was not to get to know them. When I was in this role, I visited Solomon Islands on many, many occasions. I got to know the people who were running that country personally. I think that does put the Australian government in a much better position when senior leaders actually know who they are dealing with. But the problem here is that if you look at who's governing now in this country, we can't find a relationship of substance which can be put to use in this moment. And that is the fundamental failure that we've seen in relation to this government. To try and pretend that somehow there was no advice in relation to that is just wrong. Building relationships is always the way to go. Agencies advise that, and this government has failed to do it.
How do you compete for influence with a country like China that, to quote the Prime Minister, does not play by the same rules? China can do and offer things that a Western liberal democracy cannot do and a country like Australia would never offer. How do you do that?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's exactly why building relationships and being present matters. Because we are in a contest here, and it matters that we ultimately prevail. And think about what is being said by the Prime Minister there. I mean, there's a sense of defeatism in the point that he is making, a defeatism which I don't accept. In my experience,
or realism?
and this is the answer. No, defeatism, and it's not realistic. Because in my experience, the countries of the Pacific look to Australia as their natural partner of choice. There is an affinity with Australia which countries in the Pacific feel, and if we put the work in and we put the effort in and we do the engagement right, we can be the natural partner of choice. In many respects, given all the advantages we have in terms of history, in terms of proximity, and in many ways in terms of culture, like in terms of language and the shared government systems, we have a huge advantage in the way in which we can deal with and operate with countries in the Pacific, including Solomon Islands. And I'd go further. The Regional Assistance Mission in Solomon Islands, which began under the Howard government, continued under the Rudd and Gillard governments, put Australia in a unique position in terms of its standing within Solomon Islands in terms of our standing amongst the public, but also our standing with the political class. That should have been a basis upon which we could have built a really strong relationship, as we have had in the past. The fact that we end up here says everything about the way this government actually fails to govern and fails to engage in action when it counts. You know, Scott Morrison is really big on beating his chest in Australia, but when it comes to actually operationalising whatever policy we're talking about, this is a man who goes missing. We've seen that with Solomon Islands. We've seen that in the total bungle in terms of building the hard power equation with our submarines. And we've seen that with the
but let
sale
me
of the
interrupt
Port
you
of
there. When
Darwin.
it comes to chest beating, I mean, nobody thinks China's ambitions in the Pacific are going to stop with the Solomons. If you're Australia's Defence Minister on the 22nd of May, what would a Labor government do to stop it?
Well, what an Albanese Labor government will do when it comes to the Pacific is first and foremost make sure that the Pacific is front and centre in terms of our foreign policy and front and centre in terms of our national outlook. You know, what we understand is that Australia's standing in the world begins with our standing in the Pacific. And that is a fundamental tenet which I have not seen displayed by this government, but which we did understand when we were last in government and which we would understand if we were in government again. And that means that there is a priority in terms of the actions that we take, a priority in terms of the affinity we build, a priority in terms of what we do with our development assistance, and a priority in terms of the way in which we engage. And all of that would be at a completely different level, and the record shows this.
Richard Marles, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.
Well, Scott Morrison's hinted today, but not exactly explicitly said, that perhaps Australia's intelligence agencies might have had a reasonable fix on where Solomon Islands was up to in its negotiations with Beijing. Because of the nature of intelligence, we'll probably never know exactly. But we did catch up on this question with Liberal Senator James Paterson, who's chair of Parliament's powerful Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. He joined us a short time ago from Melbourne. James Paterson, welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Accepting right off the bat that there are constraints on what Intelligence Committee members are told in camera, can I put the question, when did you first become aware that the Sogavare government had negotiated at least a draft security agreement with China?
Like the ministers in the government who've answered this question, Greg, I was aware when it was publicly revealed. But what I was aware of prior to that, and what our intelligence community has exceptionally good coverage of, is China's plans and intentions for the region. We've known for some time that it is the ambition of China to expand its presence in the region, and that it has been trying with a number of governments to have these sorts of agreements in place. So it didn't come as a surprise to anyone that China was seeking to do this, but we did learn about the agreement itself when it became public.
OK, so if China had an intent and the agencies whose job it is to know these things knew that much, why then should the public rely on the media to find out that it had actually got was as far advanced as a draft document?
One of the challenges we face in the region is that some of our potential adversaries and rivals, China included, don't operate on the same rules as we do. They are comfortable doing things which we are not comfortable doing as a rule of law liberal democracy. And one of those things that they're comfortable doing is negotiating things in secret and not providing the normal and necessary transparency on bilateral and international relations. So when we enter into these sorts of partnerships, we publicly declare that we're doing so. We publicly put on a register any treaties we enter into. We're utterly transparent about that, and our motives are clear. China does not behave that way, and so they went to some lengths to keep this arrangement secret, and that's the reality of the way they behave.
Could we reasonably expect that our relevant agencies would have today, as we speak, some understanding about the contents of this agreement and just how far-reaching it is?
Well, we have a pretty good idea from the draft agreement what China's intentions were and what they were seeking. And we also have commitments made by Prime Minister Sogavare, not just to other partners like us and to the region and to his neighbours, but to the people of the Solomon Islands about what this agreement will do and what it won't do. And some of those very important assurances he's provided is that it won't result in a military facility, a Chinese military facility on the Solomon's soil. And we welcome that. And we look forward to that commitment being adhered to. And I know that we're not the only ones who have that expectation.
Why do you believe it or expect it to be true, though? Because there's great ambiguity in these things between what might be a military base and what might be a logistics hub. Why, in essence, would you take Prime Minister Sogavare at his word?
Well, we take the commitments that our allies and friends and partners in the region make very seriously. That's a commitment that he's made to us both directly and also publicly. But it's not just a commitment to us, it's a commitment to the people of the Solomon Islands, who I don't think would welcome a Chinese military presence on a permanent basis on their own territory. And he will have to face elections like all politicians do, and he's made that commitment to them, not just to us, as well as to other islands in the Pacific who are watching this very closely and anxiously.
All right. Military base or no military base, what's your own assessment of the strategic threat that the agreement we know about poses? Is it a game changer?
There's no doubt it's a very serious challenge to our regional security, and it is an unwelcome development. We've been very candid about that, but we also need to be calm about it and keep it in perspective. We have very good relationships with the region. We have very good relationships with the Solomons. We remain the security partner of choice for the Pacific, and we are the country which is first called upon when there are domestic disturbances or other incidents and assistance is required. And we very happily and very quickly provide that. And all of our partners know in the region that we are a reliable partner, that we operate in an open and transparent way. And not every other country, China especially, can make that same claim.
I want to bring you to the intersection of this foreign policy debate and domestic politics in just one moment. But just finally, looking out across the Pacific, some analysts are predicting that the Chinese Communist Party might seek to bring some operational function to this agreement, even in the life of our current election campaign underway here in Australia. Perhaps a cargo plane landing with a few pallets on board. Does that seem likely in your own assessment?
It's certainly possible. It's certainly been their modus operandi in the past when equivalent agreements have been reached, that they seek to, as you say, operationalise them quite quickly. We would ask that if they do so, that it done be transparently and openly. And a part of that being transparent and open is the agreement itself and the guardrails that might be in it becoming transparent and public as well.
OK. Now, on the timing, do you view it as significant that it was signed and that Beijing broke news about it initially, smack bang in the middle of the election campaign here?
It's very difficult to put ourselves in the minds of Beijing and what they are seeking to do, except that we know that they have had ambitions like these for some time and that they have made approaches to other governments in the region and sought to establish equivalent arrangements with other countries in the past. And I'm sure they will take whatever opportunities are presented to them. And it is up to the governments of the Pacific to decide whether or not it is in their best interest and in their own national interest.
One byproduct of all of this for China, this opportunity, as you describe it, James Paterson, might be to seek to divide the traditional bipartisanship of Australian politics on foreign policy. Hasn't that actually worked when you consider Scott Morrison saying the Labor Party has joined the chorus of other countries attacking Australia? Have they, the Labor Party, backed the Australian government in standing up for Australia, or have they run other countries' talking points? Isn't that threatening bipartisanship?
Greg, when in the past the Liberal Party has attacked the opposition over its standing on national security, we have been rounded upon, including by the press gallery in Canberra, and told that we are breaching an unwritten convention or an unwritten rule that national security and foreign policy shouldn't be made partisan. But when the Labor Party attacks us over it, I don't see the same enforcement of that so-called convention. And I'm very disappointed by the way in which the opposition leader and the Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister have responded to this. They have sought to politicise this. They have sought to gain advantage of it, and that is actually consistent with what they've done over a long period of time. They've sought previously to blame the Australian government for the breakdown in the relationship with China, even when they're economically coercing us. They attacked us over our call for an independent inquiry into COVID origins. They attacked us when we secured the AUKUS agreement because of the upset feelings of the French government. They have sought for a long time to gain political advantage over it, but now that we're in an election campaign, they've sought the protection of bipartisanship to shield any scrutiny of their own record, and I think that's inappropriate. And when it comes to the opposition, I don't know whether Anthony Albanese or Penny Wong have been briefed on the sensitive national security elements of these arrangements.
If they
have been, Well, if they have been, I think they are irresponsibly publicly canvassing very sensitive matters. And if they have not been, then they are, without being informed, publicly canvassing these matters. Neither of those reflect on them well, and I think they should really reconsider it.
All right.
Anthony Albanese said today that one of the things he would do if he was Prime Minister was to show up and be present in the Pacific. But he hasn't made an official visit to the Pacific in the last decade. The only time on an official visit that Penny Wong has visited in recent years was 4 years ago, and that was when it was facilitated by our government. So it's very easy for them to say they would show up, but if you look at their record, they haven't done so.
All right. Well, I'm sure this has a way to run yet. But James Paterson, for sharing your views, thanks for joining us on Afternoon Briefing today.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, Greg, James Paterson there talking about the politicisation of national security. The Prime Minister had in fact made it clear today, as did the Defence Minister, that Labor hadn't been briefed by the intelligence agencies. I do wonder what the intelligence chiefs are thinking about this. I mean, I couldn't help remembering the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, before Senate estimates, you know, urging the political parties really not to politicise intelligence. I kind of feel we're in that territory again, Greg.
Well, exactly, and it doesn't seem like there's going to be much of a retreat from that territory either, Fran, because that point about Mike Burgess was put directly to Scott Morrison today, and he simply proclaimed that Prime Ministers run national security committees of cabinet, not public servants. So I guess that's his broad description of Mike Burgess, the Director General. So it's kind of like full steam ahead in this debate, I think, from his point of view.
As I'd say, I'd love to know what Mike Burgess is thinking. Greg, there's concern amongst China watchers that Beijing will now move quickly to establish a concrete presence on the ground in the Solomon Islands. Richard McGregor is the Lowy Institute Senior Fellow for East Asia. He joins me now. Richard, welcome to Afternoon Briefing.
Hi there.
Richard, can you just put all of this in context for us about what this is about? Why the panic about a security pact between China and the Solomon Islands? What's the danger here for Australia?
Well, it's a threshold event. I mean, I don't think there's going to be a massive Chinese naval base overnight in the Solomon Islands, but I would expect, and if I were the Chinese, I would move as quickly as I can while I've got a friendly Prime Minister in Honiara and establish some presence there, be it, you know, some refuelling stop, more police or paramilitary officers, so you cement your presence. And if you do that, once you've got a presence there, it's very hard to unwind because you create a dependence. And so, yes, I can understand the panic. I also think that there's been a lot of talk about, did the government know? And frankly, I don't think they did know. They certainly knew, as the Prime Minister said, that there was a risk of something like this happening. But when it happened about 3-4 weeks ago, and I've been talking to a lot of people about the possibility of it happening just prior to that, and I got no sense that they did think it was coming, and when it did land, there was panic, and that tells you, I think, that it was much further advanced than they realised.
What do you make of the timing of this? If it happened, either it happened in haste because we hadn't heard it was about to happen, you're a China watcher, you know these things, you follow these things closely, or if it was much further along. Was China planning this to drop in the middle of an Australian election campaign, or is that overstating our importance or relevance here?
Well, I think Australia is important in all of this. China is quite happy to throw a bomb into Australian foreign policy or politics, if you like. But I don't really think that it's happened in the middle of an election campaign. Remember, I think we got the first draft before the election was called. The Chinese really, in Beijing, I don't think would have been able to time it so exquisitely to do that. But in terms of, you know, roiling Australia or sticking it up Australia, yes, I'm absolutely sure they're happy to do that.
The political row you mentioned there is about the timing. When did Australian government know? Should we have known earlier? Should we have moved earlier? That's what Labor's saying here. Too little, too late from the Morrison government is the Labor catch cry, missing in action. In your view, Richard, was there anything Australia could have done to dissuade the Solomon Islands government from signing the security pact with China?
Look, I'm not really sure how definitive I could be there in that case. I mean, some people are saying that Australia has neglected the Pacific. That's not true at all. And we have not neglected the Solomon Islands as well. We've poured literally billions of dollars in there with the Ramsay security operation and foreign aid and the like. But I think maybe some people misunderstand the sort of payback you're expected to get from that. That's one thing. The second thing is that we have a particular Prime Minister in the Solomon Islands, Mr. Sogavare, who has long been suspicious and antagonistic towards Australia, and that makes him a sort of a natural target for somebody like Beijing. And of course, this has accelerated since 2019 when the Solomons switched recognition from Taiwan to China, and it's proceeded on that basis. So, you know, I kind of, yes, I mean, it's obviously a failure for Australia, but whether that means that we could have easily stopped it, I wouldn't necessarily go that far.
OK, well, how did China secure the deal? The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, referred today to, you know, China not following the normal rules of influence.
Well, it's not just China that's not followed the rules in Solomons. It was Taiwan before them. When Taiwan used to have a system where they had called constituency payments, where they would give money to each individual MP for their electorate. Once China came in, China basically, you know, the money is collected in Mr. Sogavare's office and he distributes it. So it's really a classic case of what they call elite capture, which China is very good at. You know, Mr. Sogavare is open to getting partners other than Australia. He is, as I said, suspicious of Australia, sometimes a little conspiratorially so, about us wanting to run the country. He was looking for other partners, and China was obviously right at his doorstep and right at the front door of his office. Okay. With the package to help persuade him.
Richard, can I just ask you finally and briefly, we are in the middle of an election campaign, as you've noted. The Lowy Institute conduct a thing called the annual Beijing Chinese in Australia survey. We're in the middle of this campaign. Does this survey suggest that these tensions with China will influence or could influence the way Chinese Australians vote?
Well, I'm not Anthony Green, but I'll give you a very quick opinion. I think the idea of a Chinese vote is overrated. It's a very diverse community, rich, poor, middle class, newly arrived here for decades and the like. And I don't think they're single issue voters just on the government's China policy, if they don't like that. Some of them might like it, by the way. And on the issue of racism or a rise in racially motivated attacks. So perhaps at the margin, but not in a sort of sense of a block.
All right. Richard McGregor, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, let's do a stock take on some of the issues of the campaign today and, in fact, throughout week 2 so far. Joining us today, Liberal Senator Abetz is in Hobart and Labor's Anika Wells is in Brisbane. Welcome back to both of you. Senator Abetz, we might start with you, unsurprisingly, around the Solomon Islands. You've been listening to Richard McGregor and some of our coverage. Is it safe for us to be having this debate in the middle of an election campaign? Are there guardrails around the traditional bipartisanship on foreign policy that are being threatened here from today onwards?
Wants to form the national government of Australia would always put Australia first. And what we've seen in the Solomon Islands is unfortunately another example of the belligerent dictatorship from Beijing seeking influence. It's not only in the Solomon Islands, they've done it in Sri Lanka, they've done it in Africa, they've done it in other countries as well, in a manner that we as peace-loving liberal democracies believing in the rule of law do not engage in. And so for us to be able to counter that, as has been suggested by some, and I simply say to Mr Albanese and the Labor Party, what would you have done differently? How could you and would you have stopped it? And of course that is where they can provide no explanation.
Yeah, that's a respectful question that you pose, almost rhetorically, but that's actually more restrained than what we're seeing from Scott Morrison. He dialed it up much further today, didn't he, Abetz, in essentially calling some of Labor's criticism over the years, tantamount to treachery because it's a whose side are you on equation.
Oh, look, over the years, that has clearly been the case where it seems that there are certain elements within the Labor Party who would seek to be critical of their Australian government before the communist dictatorship of China. And I would have thought any self-respecting Democrat in Australia would back in their Australian government over a belligerent dictatorship that has such a brutal human rights record to its own people. They don't believe in the rule of law. They don't believe in human rights. And so, of course, they will monster and do things to other countries that they think are vulnerable, including, unfortunately, the Solomon Islands. The full details of the deal not known to us. And in those circumstances, why you would seek to be critical of the Australian government rather than a communist dictatorship defies any explanation other than cheap political opportunism, which I personally find so very disappointing. And I say that, if I might add, as the chair of the Senate's Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee, where I seek to keep things bipartisan, and as a member of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. The national interest and being part of Team Australia has to be number one, has to be front and centre, and unfortunately we have not been seeing that of late from Mr. Albanese.
Well, let me turn that over to you, Anika Wells then. Team Australia, are you on it? What exactly is Labor's strategy here? Has it been unfairly maligned today?
It is quite the thing for Senator Abetz to, in his first breath, solemnly call for bipartisanship because of the seriousness of this. In his second breath, tear absolute partisan strips off federal Labor. And thirdly, can you imagine what he would be saying today if this had happened on federal Labor's watch? Because we have to call it what it is. It is a massive strategic failure on the part of the Morrison government. It has happened on their watch. There are reports today that they were made aware of this as far back as last August. So why was nothing done? Why was nothing done then?
Anika, what would
why
you have
didn't
done?
they know about it?
There you go. A question posed
done?
by Eric Abetz to you, Anika. What would you have done, or not you personally? What would a Labor government have done?
Well, as both our Labor leader and our Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Penny Wong, have said today, they would have gone to the Solomon Islands. And it's not just Labor saying that. Julie Bishop, former Liberal Foreign Minister, said she would have dropped everything and got on a plane. That's not what the Morrison government did. The Prime Minister didn't get on a plane. Even his Foreign Affairs Minister wasn't sent on a plane. They sent Zed Seselja. And if you were the Solomon Islands, I think that you would take that to mean that Australia is not taking this seriously.
And you think that one gesture, sending a person of a requisite qualification or seniority, would have swung it? It wasn't a deal already in the bag, Anika?
You know, I don't know what would have swung it because nothing was done. We have nothing to compare it to. We have a void of leadership as what the Morrison government decided to do with this information, which we hear today was given to them as far back as last August. That is absolutely months of consideration that they had. And as far as I'm concerned, another example of where Scott Morrison has vacated the field, just like he did with rats, just like he did with vaccines, just like he did with bushfires, and just like he's done with floods up here.
All right, Eric Abetz, last word on this, and then we'll switch it over to another issue.
What I would like to hear from Labor is their condemnation, their disagreement of this behind-the-scenes deal by China with the Solomon Islands, clearly unequal partners where a major power is monstering the Solomon Islands, and I would have hoped that Labor would have found it within themselves, rather than seeking to criticise the Australian government, to be critical of the Beijing dictatorship, the communist dictatorship, monstering a smaller country like the Solomon Islands. It just defies any explanation as to why Labor is taking the approach they are.
All right. Why don't we look at the performance of the leaders, respectively, in last night's debate? Anika, I might start with you. Do you think Scott Morrison's drawn a line under that misspeak, I suppose you would call it, referring to him and his wife Jenny having two children who didn't have disability and describing that as a blessing? He tried to clear it up. Not only tried to, he apologised today. Is that the end of it?
Yeah, and people, my constituents have been contacting the office today about how upsetting they found that. But I think what's most important is that the attention on that gaffe draws away from the real issue here, which is that mother has said that she's had a 30% cut to her NDIS package with no explanation. And that is a pretty common experience for us here in Lilly. we get NDIS inquiries and calls for assistance every single day. And I think what actually we should be taking away from what Scott Morrison said by way of answer is that it was a blessing for him and for his family not to have to deal with the NDIS. He gave away that not having to engage with the NDIS, which is under his management, under his stewardship, underfunded under his stewardship, he considers a blessing, which really reveals the state of affairs for families having to engage with the NDIS. And that's what we should be focusing on, and that's what we should be fixing.
Well, Anika Abetz, it is a big budget line item. I think it's already creeping past total Medicare expenditure. Just picking up Anika's point, still too overly cumbersome, in your view, the NDIS bureaucracy?
Look, the NDIS was a great scheme and something which I personally supported. At the time that it was being talked about under a Labor government, I urged them, in fact, to delay its implementation until such time as all the architecture was properly put in place. It was set up and started operating somewhat too early, so we are continually needing to adjust the wing nuts on the NDIS to make it fair and reasonable. And just as the lady said last night in the debate, her allocation of funding, for whatever reason, was reduced. Every single day there are other people that are having their funding actually increased. And so in the case of the lady last night, clearly that's an individual case that needs to be looked at. Are there issues with the NDIS? Yes, with a big bureaucracy that deals with about 500,000 of our fellow Australians, be it the tax office, be it Centrelink, be it immigration, be it the NDIS, there will always be the example where the system can do better, and that is where you need responsive ministers. And the Prime Minister's response, I thought, was absolutely spot on to say, let's take this offline, deal with your specific issue. And I've done that for numerous Tasmanian constituents and will continue to do so. But part and parcel of political life is that you get to hear the complaints of those that think they get a raw deal or have in fact got a raw deal. You never hear from those that say, this is a fantastic outcome, I've got the extra money or the extra facility needed. They don't come to the office with that story. So we tend to get a diet of the discontent, and that's understandable.
You're not in this business for the gratitude, I suppose, as seasoned politicians. You're also in the business of campaigning, so we're going to let both of you go and continue that journey. Anika Abetz and Anika Wells, thanks again both for joining us on Afternoon Briefing.
A pleasure.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
And Greg, it's gloves off in this campaign, that's for sure. Labor has launched its first major attack ad on Scott Morrison's character. Coming to your screen in the next few days. Let's take a look.
Going to Hawaii when half of Australia was burning was a mistake.
I don't hold a hose, mate.
Not making sure we had enough vaccines and rapid tests was a mistake.
It's not a race, it's not a competition.
No one gets it right all the time, but Morrison makes too many mistakes. Next time something goes wrong, do you trust him to make it right?
That's not my job. That's not my job. It's not my job to do that.
I'm joined now by two former campaign strategists, David Gazzard, Director of DPG Advisory, former advisor to John Howard and Peter Costello, and Ryan Liddell, the partner at Principal Advisory and former Chief of Staff to Bill Shorten. Ryan Liddell and David Gazzard, thanks very much for joining us.
G'day, Fran. No problem, Fran.
Ryan Liddell, let's deal with that attack ad. Is this how Labor plans to win the election, to just go on the attack, go negative against Scott Morrison?
Oh, well, look, Fran, I think it's important people realise that, a vote for a Liberal Party this election means 3 more years of Scott Morrison, and, that I haven't seen that ad, but that's the first time I've seen it. And frankly, I'm quite impressed they can limit that down to 30 seconds. You can make a whole feature film of Scott Morrison's record going through. Don't hold a hose. Don't, it's not my job, not ordering the vaccines, not ordering the rats, being in Hawaii when the fires are here. So I think, if Scott Morrison wants to campaign on his record and his character, I think it's incumbent on the Labor Party to remind people about who they're voting for.
Well, I understand people are going to be seeing a lot of that ad. David Gazzard, do negative ads like that work, and what do you think when you see it?
Do work. There's no doubt about that. There'll be negative ads going on either side. I think, though, the structural weakness on the Labor side in running the negative ad is they don't really present any alternative at all. You wouldn't know who Anthony Albanese is. You wouldn't know what he stands for. He's run a small target campaign in what has been a tumultuous time, and I think voters recognise that. They know that it's a difficult thing to run a government at the best of times, overlay it with a global pandemic where every country has had problems with finding rat tests and vaccines, and then put on top of that bushfires and floods and all the rest of it. It has sort of been a guy that's been trying to do 3 jobs at once. So that's fine. I think he accepts responsibility for some of the mistakes that have been made, but we've done extraordinarily well as a nation in terms of economic growth, in terms of the outcomes we've achieved, very low death rates, very high vax rates. So, you know, all things considered, it hasn't been altogether a bad story.
Okay.
It's a mixed story indeed, but on the other side, you wouldn't know what you're getting if you vote for the Labor Party.
Well, I guess that's what an election campaign is for, to try and get to know both leaders. We had the first leaders debate last night, televised on pay TV, so a pretty small audience, I have to say. But, David, the audience of undecided voters there gave Anthony Albanese a win by a narrow margin. Did you notice that? Is that how you saw it?
I've been around as long as you have, Fran, and I can't really remember that many debates where the coalition has won. In fact, I was reminded when I was driving up here of something that John Howard said, that after winning 4 elections, he'd lost every debate, but he'd won all the elections. So I think it's a fairly common thing. You look at the newspaper coverage today, there's been a far higher number of people who watched the debate and responded in print that they thought Morrison won. But how could you really tell? And is that sample representative in any case?
Well, we don't know. According to Sky News, though, it's a group of 100 undecided voters. Ryan Liddell, does last night's debate matter much at all, given it was shown to a relatively small number of voters, apart from perhaps giving Anthony Albanese a bit of a confidence boost after the rotten week he had last week?
Look, I accept David's point, but I think, you know, the real interesting thing about last night and the debate was, you know, it was quite interesting seeing, it's quite novel, this campaign, seeing Scott Morrison actually interacting with real people, you know, taking questions on issues like, you know, aged care, NDIS, climate change, that sort of thing. And I think a feature of this campaign so far, particularly from the Liberal side and Scott Morrison, has been shielding him from the public. You know, the last time we saw him out there in the, you know, the brave world of Punterland was when he was at the pub, and we certainly, in Newcastle, we certainly sort of know how that ended. So, you know, I think it was quite interesting last night seeing the questions that Scott Morrison was getting. And part of that is, you know, there's the Prime Minister's got a bit of a technique of, you know, running a filibuster, you know, winding the clock down in sort of in press conferences with journalists. Like, you can't get away with that when you're talking to people in an audience like we saw last night. People aren't going to cop those sort of answers when they're asking questions about, you know, access to the NDIS for their own child, or, you know, working the aged care sector, that sort of thing. So I think that was a really telling point.
Just one point I noticed as I watched it was the makeup of the questions. David, I wondered what you thought. Ryan Liddell's mentioned there the NDIS question. There were questions from nurses about aged care. There was questions about national integrity forums. The questions, one after the other, seemed to really hit Labor's sweet spot of policy priorities. It almost seemed like they were served up for him, but this was, you know, nothing like that, obviously. What did that say to you? Did you notice that, and what did it say to you?
Yeah, look, I did notice that, and you know, you just don't know what the makeup of that crowd is going to be and what's important to them.
Well,
I think
Sky News tells us they were undecided voters from across South East Queensland.
So you take that on face value, but you also look at the other things that are in all the other major polls, and a lot of those issues don't rate at all. But you know, you got to be able to stand up and answer those questions credibly. I mean, I thought the one thing that stood out to me last night, it was the one real mistake of the night, and it's the other structural impediment that Anthony Albanese faces, in that he didn't handle the boats question well. In fact, you know, he's trying to misrepresent the position that he's taken into almost every other election. And this is his great problem as a guy trying to lead the nation from the socialist left faction of the Labor Party. He's really sort of saying now, well, I was part of the socialist left faction of the Labor Party. I've run around saying I hate Tories and I'm fighting Tories, but now I am a Tory, and I really joined the socialist left faction so that I could form centrist economic policy and turn back votes.
Okay,
and,
just on that,
and this is where the public figures you out, right?
Just on that, Ryan Liddell, I'm sure you're keen to talk about that, but just on that point, David, that Anthony Albanese did fluff up that answer about, you know, you were against turnbacks, and we're talking back in 2013. We're here and now. Labor's position for several years now has been to support the government's policy. Do voters care about what a leader thought back in 2013, or do they care about what the position they would be taking to a government now are?
What they care about,
how does a leader reposition credibly?
What they care about is authenticity, and they will work you out.
But don't people change and grow?
They will work you out. Votes has been a problem in 7 election cycles, and the Labor Party has consistently opposed, along with Anthony Albanese, most of the government measures. Last night he got caught out saying that he supported a policy that he didn't.
To be fair, not for a while they haven't.
Yeah, but this is where the voters want to have some consistency. The world is a tumultuous place. We've got a base that's going to be only several hundred kilometres off the shores of Queensland. These are serious issues. We're coming out of a pandemic. We've got big-time economic issues that we've got to deal with. And not only do they not know really what Anthony Albanese stands for, they sort of recognise that this bloke's opposed to everything that he said he supports now.
OK. Ryan Liddell, is that fair criticism, and do you think this is a danger for Anthony Albanese?
Oh, look, I just want to pull David up on one point there. He says there was one mistake last night in the debate. You know, the Prime Minister had to apologise today for something he said in relation to a woman in the audience who talked about her son, and the access to the NDIS, and the way he characterised that. Now, I'm lucky enough to do quite a bit of work with Dylan Orcott and his organisation, Get Skilled Access, and I know how a lot of the people in the disability community were offended by that. So, you know, if you want to talk about mistakes last night, I think that's a pretty big one to be making.
I'll get David Gazzard's response to that in a moment. I think we've got the grab here of the Prime Minister apologising today. I'll see if we can bring it up. No, we don't have it. We'll come back. We've heard it. We've seen it earlier in the montage. But, Ryan, just on the point about border protection and boats turnbacks, Anthony Albanese did fluff that answer, and he knew he did because he came back at the end of the debate and tried to fix it up. How damaging is this issue for Labor?
Oh, look, you know, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel if they're going back 9 years. Like, Labor's policy has been very clear, election after election since then, that we support the government's policies in relation to border protection. So, you know, I really think that shows how desperate they actually are.
All right, we do have this grab now. This is the Prime Minister apologising for the way he answered that question last night. Let's have a look.
I meant no offence by what I said last night, but I accept that it has caused offence to people, and Dylan and I have been in contact today, and I apologise directly to Dylan about that. I would have had no such intention of suggesting that anything other than every child is a blessing is true.
David, when you saw the Prime Minister give that answer last night, did you realise there would be the negative reaction, significant negative reaction there has been today?
No, but I'm probably not sensitised in that area, so I can understand that's occurred and he's jumped on that quickly. The only point I would make is in the hierarchy of concerns that people have, I think most people would understand exactly what he said and why, and wouldn't see that as a perceived slip-up. They would be more concerned longer term around the areas that are important to them, and that's okay. Things like border security and the economy. So, I mean, you can't get away from the fact, and he's admitted it today, it was a mistake. But by the same token, I don't think it's going to move the needle when it comes to the broader issues that people are going to be really driven on when it comes to May 21.
OK, we're almost out of time. A couple of questions I want to go to you on. So in terms of moving the needle, do you think the Prime Minister accusing Labor of being on China's side, Ryan, will move the needle against Labor?
Well, let's talk briefly about that. You know, the Solomon Islands, obviously a hugely significant sort of event this week, and how did the government respond to that? You know, they send some B-grade bench warmer across, to Honiara to try and sort of deal with this issue. Like, you know, this guy is not even good enough to be in cabinet, but he's good enough to go to the Solomon Islands.
OK, but the woodchuck insults aside, how do the voters perceive this? Are they noting this, do you think? How significant is it for them?
Oh, look, I think, that the government has failed in its foreign policy agenda when it comes to the Pacific, and I think that's not being noticed by the public, which is why the government's picking a fight on it.
Quick one from you, David, on that.
I just disagree totally, utterly and fundamentally, and everything the PM has done over the last 3 years that goes to forming the Quad. He was invited to speak on this at the G7 and regional insecurity. He's working across a whole range of multilateral areas. So if it was a mistake for Australia, it was a mistake for New Zealand, it was a mistake for China, or for Japan, it was a mistake for the US, it was a mistake for India.
All right.
These are all countries that have a vested interest in the region.
OK, we're very tight now, but I do want to get a quick response from you. News poll this week, 29% of voters voting for independents or minor parties, not the major parties. Let me ask both of you quickly, would both sides now be working out how they might negotiate for a hung parliament? Ryan?
Oh, look, I'm not aware of that, but, I think it's actually a big problem for both major parties, but you look at seats like Kooyong, Goldstein, Wentworth, North Sydney, this is a bigger problem for the Liberal Party, and I think they know that.
David?
Well, there's no doubt the independents are, independent in name only and are working together only in coalition seats. The bigger thing, I think, for me out of the polls is not so much the independents, it's the huge undecided and soft vote that both sides will be going for before they confront, any questions around who they'll do deals with.
And that's what got the big surprise last time, wasn't it? David Gazzard, Ryan Liddell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks,
no
Fran.
worries. Thanks, Fran.
OK, well, Fran and I will be wrapping up very shortly, but we did just want to bring you up to date on an incident that happened in Brisbane today, where a car has crashed through the front of the electorate office of Labor MP Terry Butler. She's the member for Griffith, and her electorate office is there in Greenslopes in Brisbane. Staff were there, but no one was injured. The car fled the scene with a search underway for the driver. Police say they're investigating, but the initial assessment was that it wasn't a deliberate ramming into that building. Rather, they believe someone might have been hooning and that the act was not politically motivated. So we just wanted to bring you up to date with that. And Fran, yep, that pretty much wraps up our coverage today. Yeah, with a heavy focus on national security for the second day running. Let's wait and see whether this is one that just keeps regenerating with each passing day, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely, Greg. And remember, you can keep up to date at abc.net.au and on iView. We'll see you tomorrow.